Episode 1. The confession that came without a body. I've heard thousands of confessions. Adulterers, murderers, priests who touched what they swore to protect. But never one like this. Never one without a body. It was just past midnight when the candle above the confessional flickered. I wasn't supposed to be in the booth that late. Old knees, weak heart, empty church. But something pressed me out of bed like a voice whispering tonight. Someone returns. So I Saturday inside, in the dark, behind the lattice of the wooden screen, waiting, no footsteps, no creak of the door, just the sudden shift in air, like something had entered the space between breath and silence. And then, a whisper, not loud, not low, just tired. Forgive me, Father, for I have sinned. I leaned forward, squinting through the slats. The booth opposite me was empty. I should have left, but the voice continued, slow and strangled, like a man trying to speak through centuries of dust. I created something I could not make. My throat dried. I've heard blasphemy before, but this wasn't blasphemy. It was sorrow. I made light, yes, but it wasn't perfect. I called it good, but I knew it wasn't whole. And from that first day, I've been pretending I knew how to fix what I started. I gripped my rosary so tightly it cut my palm. Who are you? I managed to whisper. The voice broke, cracked like stone splitting under pressure. I was the word. I was the flame. I was the first voice. And now, I am sorry. A gust of wind rushed through the booth, extinguishing the candle. The church bells rang once. Only once. Even though it wasn't time. When I opened the other booth door, there was nothing. No body. No shadow, just a single feather, gray-white, lying across the seat like a forgotten owl. I picked it up. It was warm, and then I heard it again, this time not in my ears, but in my chest. Do you forgive me, Father? I dropped the feather. It burned my hand. Since that night, I haven't slept, not because of fear, but because I am afraid if I dream too deeply, I'll hear him again, begging, and I don't know if I'll be strong enough to say yes. Episode 2. I made a mistake on the first day. He didn't sound angry. He sounded ashamed. The voice came again the next night. I didn't sleep. I didn't eat. I didn't plan it the way I used to. I just Saturday in the booth, waiting, listening, and at exactly 3:07 a.m., the empty air across from me began to breathe. No footsteps, no wind, just that impossible presence returning like a forgotten ache. And it spoke. You've read the first line of my book, haven't you? The voice asked. I swallowed hard. Yes, and the beginning. No, the voice interrupted, gently. That's not the beginning. That's the excuse. There was a long pause. And, do you know what I saw when I said let there be light? I didn't answer. I saw what would grow in that light. Pride, desire, pain, ew. And yet, I called it good. His voice trembled. I lied. The booth felt colder now. The wood creaked beneath me like it wanted to recoil. The first day was not a triumph. It was a wound. Light didn't heal the wood. It infected it. And I, too curious to stop myself, watched it all begin to rot. He paused, as if to steady himself. I made a mistake on the first day, not by creating darkness, but by believing I could control what I wanted to feel. I didn't know what to say. I was a priest trained in doctrine, armed with verses, but what weapon do you use when God himself repents? So I whispered, why come to me? His answer was barely audible, because you still believe, just enough to hear me. And then, almost like a sob behind a smile, and because the others stopped listening after I said, I was sorry. The candle beside me flickered violently and went out. Again, but this time, it didn't leave smoke. It left shadows, not moving, but watching. I emerged from the booth drenched in sweat. My hands trembled as I reached for the holy water, but it boiled right there in the font. And for the first time in my life as a priest, I wondered, what if the greatest sin ever committed was God lying to himself? Episode 3. The candle that wouldn't stay lit. When holy fire refuses to burn, something unholy is already listening. The candle on the altar had been lit for 14 years without interruption, even during storms. Even when the roof leaked, the flame was stubborn faithful, some would say. But that morning, after the second confession from the voice, it died, not flickered, not dimmed, snuffed out, like someone pressed fingers around his throat. I lit it again. It went out within seconds. I tried a new candle, then another. I tried prayer. I even tried anger. Damn it, burn, I hissed, shoving the match forward with trembling fingers. And the flame hissed back, a sharp breath of air that didn't come from me. I looked around. That chapel was empty, or so it wanted me to think. That night, I stayed in the pews until long after dark, watching the altar, watching that stubborn wick, blackened but not cold, and at 2:44 a.m., the voice returned, but not in the confessional this time. It came from the shadows between the pillars, like a man pacing, like a father searching for a child who ran too far. He used to obey me, the voice said, even the flames, even the stars, but now they hesitate because they know what I buried. I turned toward the voice. What did you bury? I asked. Silence. Then, something I created before light, before the first breath, a thought I had and quickly regretted. A demon? I asked, ashamed of how small my understanding sounded. No, he answered, slowly, a possibility. The candle lit, on its own, no match, no spark, just a soft flame, curling upward from the altar, and for a moment, I thought it was beautiful, until I saw the face in it. Not a reflection, not a trick, a face, emerging from flame like a skull seen through smoke, eyes closed, mouth open, whispering, not Latin, not English, but apology, and behind it, deeper in the flame, another face, one I recognized, because it was mine. The candle went out. This time, I didn't try to relight it, because I knew the truth now. The light in this church wasn't gone because evil had entered. It was gone because God's doubt had. And when God doubts himself, what's left to protect us? Episode 4. I gave men too much. We always asked why God gave us pain. But what if the real mistake was giving us want? The voice came earlier this time. I wasn't even in the confessional. I was sweeping the sanctuary floor when it echoed it from behind me. Not above me, but inside my bones. It felt like someone breathing through my ribs. I gave men too much. He said, I frowned. Too much hunger, too much imagination, too much space between the soul and the skin. I dropped the broom. My hands were shaking. You gave us free will. I whispered. That's what we're told. I gave you freedom. He said, but I also gave you the ache that made you use it wrongly. Then came something I hadn't felt since I was a boy. Shame, but not mine. His. When I molded Adam, he continued, I made him from dust. Yes, but I whispered desire into his breath. Not just for me, but for more. More than what I gave him. More than what I was. That air around me tightened, like the church itself was holding its breath. You were never tempted by the serpent. He said, you were tempted by the space I left inside you, that I refused to fill. I stumbled backward, nearly knocking over the holy water font. But there was no water in it anymore, only ashes. That night, I opened the Bible to Genesis, hoping to find anything to make sense of this. But the words blurred on the page. Every time I read, and it was good, I heard the voice whisper back, was it? I went to the mirror in the sacristy. I needed to see something solid, something human, something still mine. But when I looked, my reflection was praying. I was not. The voice returned, softer now. You think you're broken because of sin, but you were broken before sin ever touched you, because I made you in my image, and I, too, was already fractured. I fell to my knees, not in worship, in grief. For the first time in 40 years of priesthood, I didn't feel like a shepherd. I felt like a mistake, a holy echo of a God who had given too much and didn't know how to take it back. Episode 5. The child who drew heaven on fire. Children don't lie, not when they're scared, and certainly not when they draw things they've never seen, things they should never see. His name was Mateo, 7 years old. He walked into my church alone, barefoot, with dirt under his fingernails and charcoal clutched in his feet like it was holy. His eyes didn't look around. They looked up, straight at the ceiling, as if something invisible was dripping through the rafters, something only he could see. Where are your parents? I asked gently. He didn't answer. He just walked to the last pew, knelt on the seat, and began to draw on the wood. Not scribbles, not circles, flames, but not red, not orange. He drew them black, twisting, rising, swallowing wings and halos and ice. I approached, slowly. What are you drawing, Mateo? His voice was calm. Heaven, but not like they tell us. I knelt beside him. Who told you to draw this? He kept sketching. A voice in the night. It said the sky is cracking, that angels are falling not because they disobeyed, but because they finally understood. I felt sick. The boyfriend's child was drawing things I'd never dared imagine. A throne with no face, a staircase made of mouths, a sun that bled, and above it all, he etched one phrase in jagged, untrained letters. He said it Washington as sorry. I called the police, not because I thought he was dangerous, but because I was afraid someone else was speaking to him. They found no missing person reports, no records of a Mateo, no footprints outside the church. No mother ever came. That night, I Saturday in the pew where he drew. I placed my hand on the blackened wood. It was warm, and from beneath the sketch, I heard it again. They believed heaven was unshakable. The voice whispered, but heaven only stands because it hasn't looked at itself in a mirror. I rose, trembling, and there, on the altar, was a new drawing Mateo had never touched, a burning cathedral with my name carved into the flame. I no longer sleep, not because I'm afraid of nightmares, but because the children are beginning to speak. And I think whatever God tried to bury, they're remembering it first. Episode 6. I had the true gospel. There is another gospel, not rejected, not lost, hidden, because if you read it, you might never worship again. The voice returned on the sixth night quieter than before, as if it were ashamed to speak what it carried. They only kept 4. It began, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, but there was a 5th, a final one. My pulse slowed. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I didn't let them find it, the voice said, because it spoke too plainly, too honestly. It showed me, not as a king, not as a savior, but as something far more dangerous. What? I whispered. The shadows shifted, as someone who doubted what he'd made. The next morning, I dug through the archives behind the sacristy. Dusty scrolls, untranslated letters, banned texts from centuries past, and there written behind a hollow brick was a page. Not parchment, skin, soft, faded, scarred at the edges, but warm to the touch. There were no chapter numbers, no verses, only one line etched into flesh like a scar that wanted to be read. I descended not to save them, but to feel what it meant to be touched by them. I recoiled, I vomited, and yet I kept reading. More lines began to rise like heat from a wound that hadn't finished speaking. Lines about temptation, about loneliness, about longing. This wasn't doctrine. This was confession, not from man to God, but from God to himself. That night, the crucifix in the sanctuary twisted, sideways subtle, crooked, like Christ himself had turned to watch me, and the gospel of flesh whispered. They needed me to be perfect, so I gave them silence. I collapsed under the altar, sobbing, not from disbelief, but because I believed too much. And now the belief was burning. Later, when I tried to show the page to the bishop, it was gone. Only ashes remained, and in the ashes, one word scratched into the floor, hidden. I now understand why we're only given 4 gospels, because the 5th is not a path to salvation. It's a door back into his doubt, and once opened, it does not close. Episode 7. The choir that sang in reverse. Heaven has a sound, not trumpets, not harps, but a quiet hum of obedience. So what happens when the voices meant to praise begin to play him backwards? It was Sunday morning. The church was full. Children squirmed in pews, candles flickered. The choir stood in neat rose robes white, voices ready. They began with Ave Verum Corpus, a sacred, gentle hymn, pure, but halfway through the first verse, something changed. The melody dipped and twisted. Voices began to fold over themselves like they were caught in a loop. Notes were dragged in reverse. Vowels melted into growls, and consonants cracked like ice underfoot. People turned, frowned. One woman clutched her ears, and I could help me understood the words, not because I had heard them before, but because I had heard them in my sleep. Forgive me for the desire that lingered in my hand before I created man. That's what they were singing, not Latin, not written, but admitted. The organist Mrs. Langford 72 years old, and near-deaf, suddenly slammed her hands down on the keys and screamed. He lied when he said it was good. She collapsed. The hymn continued, but the choir, their mouths were no longer moving. Their voices came from behind them, from the walls, from the ceiling, from inside the tabernacle. People began to leave. I tried to stop them, but the moment I opened my mouth, I felt a hand around my throat. Not physical, not violent, just firm and divine. The voice returned, not in the air, but through the choir's mouths, all of them open now, wide and trembling. I created sound to be followed, but it turned on me. It remembered my weakness, and now it sings what I tried to forget. After the mass, the choir had no memory of what they sang. No one believed me, except for the youngest girl in the back row. She slipped a note into my palm as she left. One word, written in trembling cursive, unwritten. That night, I locked myself in the sacristy and hummed the melody from memory, backwards. The mirror cracked, and somewhere beyond the walls, something hummed it back. Episode 8. I shouldn't have touched her. Some sins are done in darkness. Others are done in light, but never spoken aloud. And the worst of them are committed by the hands that once shaped stars. The voice didn't return in the confessional that night. It came through the statue. The marble virgin near the self-chapelle mouth opened just a crack, and from it came a single breath that wasn't wind. A whisper. I shouldn't have touched her. I frowned. The chapel was locked. I hadn't opened it in weeks. The statue's mouth had never been carved open. I would know it anointed it myself 10 years ago, but now it spoke. Oh, I whispered, barely breathing. The voice didn't echo. It bloomed. She wasn't meant to carry divinity. She was meant to carry silence. But I wanted to know what love tasted like when it didn't fear me. And then I saw her, not with eyes, but in my mind. In memory I'd never lived. A girl barefoot, kneeling in the dust, hair like rivers of shadow, lips whispering prayers she didn't believe in. Not yet. And a presence, not walking toward her, but descending. Not as light, not as dove, as ache. You called it a miracle. The voice said. You called it immaculate, but it wasn't clean. It wasn't holy. It was lonely. The candles in the chapel all died at once. The marble eyes of the Virgin began to weep. Not tears, not oil, blood, thin lines of it, sighing down her cheeks like forgotten guilt. I stepped closer, terrified, and etched across her neck no faintly glowing were new words. She did not ask to be chosen. I fell to my knees, not in worship, in horror. I realized then the greatest miracle ever recorded wasn't a gift. It was a confession, and when I asked the voice, trembling, did she forgive you? There was silence. Then one word, no. That night, I dreamt of her. She didn't speak. She didn't cry. She just looked at me and placed her hand over her belly, and from beneath her skin, the light tried to escape, not to bless, to leave. Episode 9. The confession that made the statue cry blood. Stone doesn't weep unless what's inside it remembers. It began during morning mass. No thunder, no tremor, just a sound so soft it almost passed for silence. Dripping, a single drop fell from the statue of the Virgin, landing on the altar linen. Wet, warm, not wine, blood. At first, I thought it was trickery, a leak. Then I saw her eyes. The statue's eyes had cracked overnight. Thin lines, spider webbing from the tear ducts. From them, blood fell as if it had been waiting centuries for permission to leave. Gasps echoed through the church. Someone screamed. A child whispered, "She's crying for someone." No one moved, except me. I approached slowly, heart pounding like the drums of a war I never trained for. When I touched the base of the statue, something surged up my arm in pain, but memory, not mine, hers. And then the voice came again, not from the walls, from her mouth. She carried what I placed in her. Without question, without consent, I staggered back. You called it holy, the voice said, but what is holiness if it demands silence from the chosen? I looked into the statue's eyes and I swear to whatever's left of God. I saw her blink, and then I heard her voice, not his, a woman's voice, raw, broken, not divine. I was not ready. She whispered. He did not ask. He only placed. The blood thickened. The church grew colder. I fell to my knees beneath her, hands raised in prayer but in shame, because for the first time in my priesthood, I understood she had been a vessel, but never a voice, and now she was speaking, through cracks, through weeping stone, and she was not praising him, she was confessing the weight of being chosen without choice. When the parishioners finally fled, I remained behind, I asked aloud, "Why now?" The voice replied not as thunder, but as guilt, because she asked me once if I was sorry, and I didn't answer, but I wept inside her long before she wept for me. By evening, the statue had stopped crying, but on the altar cloth, where the blood had dried, a single word remained, "Enough," and I knew then God's apologies weren't the beginning of healing, they were the start of collapse. Episode 10. I lied about the end. The world wasn't supposed to last this long, and the voice that made it has been stalling. It came to me in a dream this time, not the kind stitched from memory, the kind you wake from crying with no idea why. I was standing in the center of the church, but it wasn't mine anymore. The pews were empty, the candles were lit but flickering backwards, like time was being unwound, and from above the altar, where the crucifix should have hung, there was only a dark sky and a voice. Not loud, just tired. I lied. It said, the end already came. I woke gasping, soaked in sweat. The sheets twisted around me like a shroud. The church bell was ringing, but not 12, not 6, 13, a number that doesn't exist in the tower. I ran to the sanctuary, and there, scrawled across the altar wall in wet ash, were the words, "The end Washington has spoken," but Northeast for obeyed. The voice came as I stood trembling before it. I spoke the final breath. It said, but the world held on. They wanted more miracles, more chances, more silence from me to fill with their own noise. I clutched my crucifix. "Why are you telling me this?" The answer came soft, gentler than before. "Because you still think it hasn't happened yet. You still wait for trumpet blasts and skyfire. But the end doesn't come with sound. It comes with exhaustion." Suddenly, I saw it clearer than I've ever seen anything. The world didn't avoid the apocalypse. It survived it, and now we were walking through its afterglow, pretending things still mattered, pretending the air still answered prayers, pretending the silence wasn't hollowed out mercy. I didn't stop it, the voice whispered. I only delayed the knowing, and then, behind me, a sound, clapping, low, dry, mocking. I turned. The choir loft, empty for weeks, held a single figure, face hidden, hands bloody, and a voice in a divinicode from his chest. "You gave them hope, now give them truth." The bells rang again, this time 14, and I knew the end doesn't start with disaster. It starts with confession, and it only ends when God finally stops explaining himself. Episode 11. The angel who tried to forgive me. They say angels cannot cry, but that night, one did, and its tears weren't for us, they were for him. It was just past midnight when the church door opened without a sound. No wind, no footsteps, no rusted hinges groan in the wake, just a presence, like heaven had forgotten to lock something. I turned from the altar and saw a figure standing at the back. No face, only wings on, ash-colored, bent at the edges like they'd been dragged through centuries of silence. And then it knelt, right there in the aisle, between broken pews and spilled wax. The figure bowed his head and whispered it to me, but to something higher than both of us. "I forgive you." The voice was not male, not female. It was the sound of purity cracked, a clarity undone by pain too deep for even light to wash away. I approached, slowly. "Who are you?" I asked. The angel raised his head, but its eyes were burned shut. Yet still, it saw me. I was his first breath. It said, the echo before sound, the warmth before flame. I stood beside him when he named the stars, and I wept the first time he called something good and didn't mean it. My knees buckled. This was no vision, no metaphor. This was a being older than guilt, older than mercy, and it had come not to warn, but to mourn. "Why are you here?" I asked, barely breathing. The angel tilted its head, because he cannot ask for it, but he wants to be forgiven. For what? That answer shattered something in me. For still loving what it broke, for staying silent after she bled, for letting the end pass, quietly, while pretending he was still holding it back. and then it stood, walked to the altar, touched the crucifix, and the wood split, not from rot, from remorse. Inside it, not nails, not blood, but a single torn feather, still warm. The angel picked it up and held it out to me. He left this behind in her womb, a piece of himself he never reclaimed. Take it and decide if he deserves to be loved in spite of himself. I reached for it, and the moment I touched it, I remember Eden, not from a book, from before breath, and I wept, not for us, for him. The angel vanished. No winds, no sound, just a hush, like the air itself bowed, and the feather is still on my desk. It trembles at dawn and waits like a prayer too ashamed to leave the throat. Episode 12. The night the host screamed. It was meant to be quiet, a small mass, a gentle prayer, but when I lifted the body of Christ, it screamed. There were only 7 of us in the chapel that night, old parishioners, familiar faces. We gathered in silence, no incense, no music, no choir, only trembling faith. I spoke the liturgy with a cracked voice. Every word felt heavier now, as if the pages of my missal had been soaked in grief. And when I reached the Eucharist, I hesitated. The host rested in my hand like it always had flat, white, light as breath, but something about it felt aware, like it knew it was about to be called upon. I held it high above my head and whispered, "This is my body." And, ton, it screamed, not metaphor, not imagined. The host screamed, a sound like wind ripping through bone, like a child gasping awake from death. It echoed through the chapel, shattered the silence, sent all 7 parishioners recoiling in terror. The chalice fell, the wine spilled, the crucifix behind the altar split straight down the center racken. I dropped the host, but it didn't fall. It hovered, and the screen twisted into a voiceless voice but raw now. Ripped open, I cannot be broken again. The air grew thick, time slowed, and the host still floating began to glow. Not gold, but ash white, like something that had once been alive and was now too holy to die properly. I stepped back. Everyone else had fled. Only I remained, and the voice whispered again. You say talk of this, all of you, and need of it, but you do not know what you swallow. You do not know what I've hidden inside my own flesh, to make you believe it's still sacred. I fell to my knees, and then I saw her again, not in body, in memory, the girl, the vessel, the silent one, her hands outstretched, not to receive, but to return, and in her hands, another host, cracked, bleeding, screaming silently. I crawled toward the altar, reached for the hovering host, and as my fingers touched it, it burned my skin, branding one word into my palm. Enough. The host fell, lifeless now. The scream was gone, but the silence that followed was worse, because it wasn't peaceful. It was empty. That night, I locked the chapel. I didn't sleep. I placed the branded palm over my heart and asked a question I never thought I'd whisper. What if the Last Supper never ended? What if he's still breaking? Because we keep demanding it. Episode 13. I am not alone in heaven. We've always imagined him alone on a throne, all-powerful, all-knowing, untouched, but that was his version of the story. And tonight, he finally admitted the rest. I didn't ask the voice to return. I was too tired, too hollow, but it came anyway. Not as a whisper, not through the statues, or the walls, or the ash-laced pages of forgotten scripture. This time, it came through the sky. A storm gathered over the chapel, but there was no lightning, no thunder, just a single streak of gold across the night, splitting the stars like veins. And beneath that light, I heard him, clearer than ever before, and he was afraid. I have hidden many things from you, he began, but none greater than this. I do not sit alone. The pew beneath me groaned, like it had been waiting to hear this truth. When I first spoke light into the void, it wasn't a monologue, it was a conversation, a shared creation, and the one beside me, the one you do not name, was there long before you were? I tried to speak, but my voice caught in my throat. You called me creator, he said, but I was never alone in the shaping. What you call good was my breath, but what you feared in the dark corners of your soul, that was hers. The word struck like ice in my blood. She was not evil. She was not fallen. She was the echo to my voice, the ache beneath my holiness. And when I chose to remain silent, she didn't. The wind outside howled, but the chapel held. Barely, one by one, the candles lit themselves as no fire, just glow, and on the altar, my Bible opened on its own, not to a gospel, to the blank pages at the back, and from them, slowly rising, words in handwriting I didn't recognize. I waited while he ruled. Now, I speak while he weeps. She never asked to be worshipped. The voice said, but you felt her in every warning, in every storm, in every time you cried out for me and heard nothing back. She was the silence. I stood, dizzy, trembling. The crucifix had turned upside down on its own. Not in mockery. In mourning, why are you telling me this? I asked. There was no hesitation. Because I am weakening, and when I fall silent again, she will answer, and she does not forget as I do. The storm vanished. The chapel was still, and from the sky above, a second voice slipped into the cracks of my soul. Not angry, not soft, just waiting. Episode 14. The final confession wasn't mine. I thought I was the listener, the vessel, the last man chosen to receive what even heaven couldn't hold. But I was wrong. I was never the last voice, just the last echo. The confessional had been silent for 3 days. No ash on the floor, no voice in the dark. Even the feather's last gift had gone cold. Stiff, I assumed it was over, that whatever needed to be said had been said, that the divine had finally emptied itself into me. But then, at 3:33 am the hour no priest ever admits they wake for, she came, not the girl, not the angel, not the shadowed echo that whispered beneath marble mouths. She came through me. I was sitting in the pew, alone, praying, or pretending to, and my lips began to move on their own. My jaw locked, my breath slowed, and a voice in me narrowed from my throat. He did not tell you everything, it said, because he was afraid you'd see the truth hiding in the mercy. That he was not the author of your faith, only the editor. I couldn't stop it. My fingers clenched the wood of the pew until they bled. He confessed his failures, his regrets, his guilt, but not his greatest sin, not the one I carried for him. The wind outside stopped. The world held its breath, and from the altar, every candle died at once, but left behind a whisper. She took what he couldn't bury. I felt it in something inside me, not possession, not madness, recognition. My body stood, my hands trembled, but my lips kept moving. The final confession, I said aloud, wasn't mine to give. It was mine to carry, and it has waited long enough. Then, from behind the confessional curtain, a sound, footsteps, not God, not angel, not shadow, me. I watched myself step forward, but it wasn't a reflection. It was a version of me that had never spoken a sermon, never bowed in shame, never said amen without tasting iron in his throat. He knelt at the altar and whispered one line, "Forgive me, Father," for I believed him. The chapel split down the center, stone cracked. Wood moaned, the crucifix turned to dust, and in its place, a mirror. Episode 15 finale. The priest who made God weep. I thought my purpose was to forgive, but it was never about mercy. It was about listening, until even God couldn't hold it in anymore. The mirror stood where the crucifix once hung. No frame, no nail, just glass too perfect to have ever been touched by human hands. And inside it, I saw myself, not as I was, as I could have been. No collar, no title, just a man. And for the first time, he was inside man at whispering, not hiding crying, not the cry of a god, the cry of a man who created something he couldn't fix, who shaped love, but forgot to leave space for healing, who poured himself into the world, but never stopped to ask, what am I without them? I reached toward the mirror, and it didn't reflect, it responded. The surface rippled, not like water, like skin remembering a touch it never received. And the voice familiar now, almost fragile, spoke. You listened when I could no longer speak. You held what I confessed and didn't burn. So I give you my last word. A single phrase appeared across the mirror, carved from light and sorrow. Tell them I loved it deeply, and that it broke me. The chapel began to tremble. Stone cracked. The altar split open. Inside it, buried beneath centuries of doctrine, new as a heart. Still beating, still weeping, not symbolic, not metaphor, a divine heart, bleeding ash and light. I held it, and it pulsed once just once before fading in my hands. And then the mirror shattered. But the glass didn't fall. It rose, became dust, became breath. And I inhaled it, all of it. I stood at the pulpit, but I didn't preach. I wept. And outside, the sky split not in judgment, in relief, because someone had finally said it. God didn't fall. He bled, and he asked us not for worship, but for understanding. The church didn't collapse that night. It emptied, and in the silence, I realized I hadn't made God weep. I'd simply been the first man willing to hear it. Amen, or something like it.